Now, we're part of a continent called North America. We presumptuously call ourselves Americans, as though there are no other Americans around. But anybody who can look at the map realizes there are Americans all the way from Baffin Island in the north all the way down to Cape Horn. So strangely enough, America is part of North America. Isn't that strange? America is part of North America, and North America, certainly in recent years, has been coming together. There was an agreement reached during the Clinton administration, which is ending, I think, this Monday. Right? There was an agreement that was made during the Clinton administration, which we call the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was an attempt to create in North America what had been begun in Europe, the integration of the economies of the United States and Canada and Mexico. Now, this morning I've decided to turn to our own place, our own continent, and to two countries which we take for granted. It is appalling to me, and I've mentioned this before, it is appalling to me that we live next door to Canada. And if you open up most American newspapers, including the New York Times, there's almost no news of what goes on in that country. It's right across the river. We do take it for granted. We read about Sri Lanka somewhere and what's happening in Indonesia and what's happening in the Congo, but a very important election that just took place in Canada, if I ask most people about it, they're unaware of the details. And yet that impinges on our lives much more than what happens far, far away. And the other is Mexico. The presence of Mexico is not simply on the border. Obviously, if you live in Texas the way George Bush used to. No. If you live in Texas, you're very much aware of Mexico. If you live in Southern California or Arizona, you're very much aware of Mexico. But the other presence of Mexico are the millions of people who now live in the United States of America, either legally or illegally, who are part of our environment, right? We encounter them all the time. They are, in a sense, to us, what the Turks and the Algerians and the Tunisians and whatever are to the Europeans, and this presence. So Mexico is of great importance to us because predictions have been made that within just a few decades, over 1/4 of the entire population of the United States of America will be Mexican. So we better look at our neighbors. And the story of our neighbors cannot really be separated from the story of the United States of America. Certainly major wars fought by the American people relate to both Canada and Mexico. So what I want to do is first look at Canada, and then, after the break, look at Mexico, and then at the very end, try to see what it all means. In terms of the connection between the States and Canada and Mexico, are there certain common themes that we should perceive? In 1763, some 237 years ago, there came into existence, as a result of a war, which was called in North America the French and Indian War, but in Europe it was called the 7 Years' War. There came into existence this major entity called British North America. British North America, as a result of the defeat of the French by the British, stretched all the way from the North Pole all the way down to the tip of Florida. And in its southern reaches, it was narrower because it only went from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. But in its northern reaches, it sort of drifted off into no man's land, an unexplored land. It was all British North America, and included more than 13 colonies. in addition to the 13 colonies with which we are familiar, it included something called Canada. And it was to include, in a very short while, a colony called Nova Scotia, and one called New Brunswick, and one called Prince Edward Island, and one called Newfoundland. Oh. All part of British North America. And 13 or 12 years after the establishment of British North America, it split in two as a result of a rebellion. The rebellion was a civil war. It wasn't simply a rebellion of the Americans against the British. The Europeans, who were overwhelmingly in the colonies, were Englishmen. And it was a war between Englishmen and Englishmen. The ones who rebelled against the authority of the king and wanted their independence were called rebels. And those Englishmen who thought of themselves as Americans, in fact, they fought in military units that were called the Royal American Rangers, were called by themselves loyalists. Their enemies, the rebels, gave them a pejorative name. They called them Tories. They didn't like them because the Tories were the enemies in England. So the rebels and the loyalists. And the war went on. And ultimately, in 1783, 20 years after the creation of British North America was divided in two. The southern part of it, containing most of the people of European origin, became the United States of America. And the northern part, which remained loyal to England and remained a part of the British Empire, came to be called mainly Canada, although there were these other colonies around, I told you. Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, they weren't part of Canada. And from the very beginning, the split created an intense hostility. It's not easy for us today to understand when we cross the border to go to the casino or to Stratford or wherever we're heading. It's very hard for us to understand the hostility that existed between these two parts of North America at the beginning. There was great anger, and in fact, Detroit lay right on the dangerous and vulnerable frontier. The British, in fact, did not surrender Detroit until 13 years after the completion of the war because they complained about the treatment of the loyalists on the part of the rebels. And until restitution was made, we understand that word, reparations, they were not going to turn over Detroit. So they held on to Detroit until 1796. British North America had to be reconstituted after the loss of 2/3 of its territory. It was built around a main colony which straddled the St. Lawrence River, which is called Canada, which was divided into two parts. The part inhabited by the original French European settlers was called Lower Canada, not Quebec. And the part which is today called Ontario was called Upper Canada. And in fact, in 1791, when these two parts of Canada were created by British decree, the major settlement in Upper Canada was Detroit, which had not yet been surrendered. The first elected official in Detroit to attend a legislature was elected to the Lower Canadian, or the Upper Canadian legislature, which met in Newark. Today, it's one of my favorite little towns. It's called Niagara-on-the-Lake and features the Shaw Festival, all right? But Mr. Macomb did not go. There was no Lansing. And there was no Washington, D.C. Mr. Macomb went to Newark. So they created Lower and Upper Canada, and they also, at the same time, established a major urban center. The major urban center of Canada until after World War II is a city that many of us used to visit. It still has a certain grandeur, although it's now quite shabby, I think. It's called Montreal. When I was a child, who would go to Toronto? It was governed by a Presbyterian Sabbath. There was nothing you could do on Sunday. There was nothing you could do on the weekends. I mean, it was an absolutely impossible place, the place that was interesting, the place where the culture was, the place where the banks were, the place where the power was in Canada was in Montreal, and for good reason, because ocean-going vessels could come all the way up to Montreal. The major port of entry for immigrants into Canada was Montreal. Now, from the very beginning, this remaining part of British North America had problems. First of all, it was comparatively empty of people. I mean, if you're afraid of the Americans, you need what? People to oppose them. Even if you count the Native Americans or the Native Canadians who were there, they were few in number, and the number of Europeans, whether they were French or English or other immigrants, was very, very small. The distance between the various settlements of Canada were very, very great, and the means of transportation was not easy. I mean, the major means of transportation was the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes. But the danger of that means of transportation was that most of the length of it was shared with the enemy, the United States of America. I mean, from Montreal, that's one of the reasons why Montreal was created. There's another major river that flows into the St. Lawrence, which became a major river of transportation for people heading westward. It's called the Ottawa River. From the Ottawa River, you can connect ultimately to Georgian Bay and then work your way up into the northern territories. One of the major challenges was that the overwhelming majority of the people living in British North America were not British. They were French. And not only French, they were devoutly religious. They were devout Roman Catholics, a religion persecuted by the English at the end of the 18th century. And most of these people did not want to be part of British North America. The only reason they were part of British North America was they were captured in the war between 1756 and 1763. One of the major problems, of course, was that there were refugees. Several 100,000 loyalists who were Americans, who had fought for their king, were expelled from their homes. They were tarred and feathered. I remember when I was in public school, they tarred and feathered the Tories. Who cared? It was like interning the Japanese in California. Weren't they the enemy? Right? They lost their property, and they were driven out. Some of them went back to Great Britain, but most of them headed north. And now you had to accommodate them. Boatloads came from New York to Halifax, or else they went through upstate New York and they crossed over to the area in northeastern Ontario, to the east of Toronto, and they tried to settle down there. How do you accommodate them? But the most important challenge, of course, was the Americans. The Americans had tried to take Canada in the Revolutionary War. An army led by Benedict Arnold, who at that time was a good guy, marched north from New York City and headed for Montreal, which was taken, and then they marched toward Quebec, which they were unable to take. The Americans desperately wanted Canada. They believed it was part of British North America, and all of British North America rightfully belonged to them. So from the very beginning, it was very clear. The Americans want Canada. By the way, it may still be the case, although we never say it out loud. The Americans may still want Canada. And so that remained a major threat. How to define yourself against the Americans when you were so much like them, at least the English-speaking Canadians, and how to defend yourself. So the response to the challenge of the Americans primarily and the other challenges was the bringing of immigrants over to Canada. The immigrants were primarily recruited in Great Britain. They were brought over generally between 1820 and 1880, the first great wave, and they included thousands and thousands of Scots. Almost all of Western Ontario up until 1900 was a Scottish preserve. You have a lot of names in Ontario that are Scottish, Perth, Allure, whatever they were. I mean, they're of Scottish origin, and everybody who crosses the river knows that people say a boot. And that's the Scottish influence. So they brought settlers in, and they settled them in the areas that needed people. The British made a deal with the Catholic Church in Quebec, where in England they were persecuting it. They made a deal going back to the 1780s, whereby the church would be protected. Its property would be protected, its clergy would be protected, and the practice of the Roman Catholic religion, forbidden in other parts of the British Empire, would be allowed in Canada. Without that, Canada would have been unsustainable. I mean, it couldn't have been sustained. One of the responses was to create a line of fortresses along the border. One of the most charming places, I regard as the most beautiful spot in the Detroit area. If you haven't been there, go there immediately. Not during the lecture, but I mean, you know. It could be the setting of another Canadian festival, like Stratford and the Shaw Festival, because it's an old British colonial port. The town is called Amherstburg. It's across from Boblo, and there is the famous Fort Malden. In 1796, when the British evacuated Detroit, they crossed the river and they built this mighty fortress with big guns that would control the what? The Detroit River, so the Americans could not easily use it, and the fortresses were all there. In response to this, they fought a war. In 1812, when the British were all caught up in fighting Napoleon, America stabbed it in the back. It invaded Canada. That's what the War of 1812 is all about. The Americans invaded Canada, and their aim was to take it. General Hull from Detroit crossed the Detroit River and invaded Canada. And they invaded Canada from New York State, and they felt it would not take long. Now, the great epic struggle that defines Canadian patriotism, or at least Canadian English patriotism, is the War of 1812. Because, and we all know the candy in Canada, Laura Secord, are you familiar with that? The candy? Well, little Laura was Betsy Ross, right? She went around and she helped the British defeat the Americans and whatever, and she's like a Canadian hero. They developed their own epic struggle. They kept the Americans out of Canada. When it was over, the only victory the Americans could claim in that war was the capture of New Orleans by Andy Jackson, far, far away from Canada. Basically, the Americans lost the war, something I was never told in public school, because at that time, before the Vietnam War, but did we ever lose? We never lost a war. One of the responses, which is very important and relates to the present thing, in 1838, a governor general arrived in Canada from England whose name was Lord Durham. And he recognized that if Canada was to survive against the Americans, that what it needed was cultural unity. So he decided that the French language had to go. And in fact, for a period of 10 years, the British vigorously pursued what we would call the Anglification of Canada. That is, the forcing of all French to ultimately use English and to create a kind of cultural unity, the same kind of cultural unity as existed in the United States of America. Ultimately, that program failed. The United States was successful in forcing all immigrants to speak English. But the British in Canada were not successful in forcing the French in Quebec to abandon French. And then, in order to prevent the Americans from coming up the rear would be that they would come like this. The British established a colony on the Pacific which was called British Columbia. And then after 1865, when it was very clear that the British government, having been sympathetic to the Confederates, and the Union government of Abraham Lincoln and then Andrew Johnson being hostile to the British, there was the great threat that now the victorious Union Army, mobilized, would invade Canada. And so to defend it, a federation was created, which is called the Dominion of Canada, which included the Federation of Canada, that's Quebec and Ontario, together with Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island, together with British Columbia, and together with his vast territory that had been taken by the British, by a British fur trading company called, you can still see the department store, Hudson's Bay. That company, the company is still there. It is most likely the oldest department store company in the world. It goes back to 1670. I do not know of any department store in the world that can go back to 1670 because they control this. All of that was merged and federated. And the motivation was the great fear. It's always the fear. Canadians are obsessed with Americans. Americans ignore Canadians. But Canadians are obsessed with Americans because their whole history is what? Trying to defend themselves against being absorbed, being taken. Now, once the Federation was created, it had to be made strong. And so what it did was it achieved autonomy, meaning it ceased to be a colony and now became basically a kind of self-governing territory in the British Empire. It had its own parliament, and initially they thought of putting the capital somewhere in Montreal, but that was assumed too dangerous because it was too close to the American border. So they built a capital in the middle of nowhere, up the Ottawa River, named what? Ottawa, and the city was like Washington, D.C. It was crafted from nowhere. They then created provinces. There were already the original colonies, which now took different names. Lower Canada became Quebec. Upper Canada became Ontario. But this vast Hudson Bay territory now was divided up, and ultimately by the beginning of the 20th century, just as in the United States, they created new provinces. Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and new territories, the Yukon Territory, and all of that. Now, in order to give Canadians a sense of significance against the Americans, I still remember this because this was the feeling before World War II. How do you make yourself feel important? After all, the Americans had become this overwhelmingly successful people. Well, when I used to cross to Windsor to visit relatives, there was a flag that waved at the foot of Olette or Ouellette. It was the Union Jack. They didn't have this newfangled thing called the Canadian flag. They flew the Union Jack. Do you remember the Union Jack? Flew To be Canadian, certainly up until World War I, and to some degree between World War I and World War II, was to be part of the British Empire. And to be part of the British Empire, which was the greatest and most powerful political entity in the world, was even more important than what? Being American. In fact, Canadians looked to London, not London, Ontario. They looked to London as the center. They felt themselves part of something. That's what the British did. They created this empire, and they gave all the people, whether you were in Australia or New Zealand or Canada, wherever you were part of the what? You were part of the great British Empire with all the panoply and everything else and splendor that went with it. Along the way, they developed political parties. The two political parties of Canada, which to some degree remained until the recent debacle in the election, were the Liberals and the Conservatives. What was the difference between them? Well, very simple. The Conservatives were more pro-British than the Liberals. They loved the king. They loved the queen. And they loved the British aristocracy. They loved the British connection. The Liberals were always those who obviously cherished the British connection, but they what? They wanted more separation, and that was the basic difference between the Liberals and Conservatives. There were not great economic issues that divided them. The Liberals were certainly not socialists. One of the things they did, of course, was to invite thousands and thousands of people to come to Canada. Not easy. If you could go to America, why would you go to Canada? It's colder. They were second best. They were second choice. In fact, the great Canadian immigration, to a large degree, happened after, in 1924, the United States of America closed the door. You couldn't get into America, so you went to Canada. And then you tried to sneak into America. You went down to Amherstburg, you took the Boblo boat to Boblo, and then you got on the Detroit boat and came into Detroit, and nobody checked your passport or your visa, which you certainly didn't have. So that was the route. So what they got were people who didn't mind living in the cold. One of the largest groups that immigrated to Canada, they're part of the story now that I will tell. One of the largest groups that immigrated to Canada were the Ukrainians. And they came in large numbers, and they got to Montreal, and then they were unceremoniously put on trains that took them all the way to the west, and then they were dumped onto the Western Plain, where, since they were peasants, they what? They had agricultural skills, and there was this rich prairie land in the Canadian West, which corresponds to what's to be found in the American West. This boundary is totally what? Artificial. So they became the great wheat growers. Whole areas of Western Canada for years were just Ukrainian speaking. And in fact, in addition to all the people that came from Great Britain, the English and the Irish and the Scots, there were also Ashkenazic Jews who came from Eastern Europe, who mainly settled in the major cities like Montreal and Toronto. Some of there were too many. Whatever it was. And in addition, fishing, and certainly in Canada there is no shortage of trees. What? Timber. Certainly prior to World War I, that was the profile. During this entire time, there was what I call some serious problems which apply to what's happening right now. From the very beginning, English-speaking Canadians had difficulty distinguishing themselves from Americans. I mean, their greatest problem is that when they go traveling abroad, most foreigners can't tell the difference between an American and a Canadian. They can tell the difference from the accent between a what? Where French, we used to have a word that we can't, there's no longer politically correct, so I will say it once and I won't repeat it. Eskimo, can't say it. You only heard me say it what? Once. Will not say it again. The correct word is Inuit. And uh, what can see what's happening. I can think of at least a dozen people who have moved their manufacturing operation from the United States of America to Mexico. There is cheaper labor, and now they can find a skilled workforce. Do you understand? It means integration, doesn't it? Because in the end, integrating with Mexico isn't simply integrating with a country south of the border. It means integrating with the population